Good afternoon, everybody. Please sit down. Thank you very much all for coming from far and wide. I think Berlin wins it at the moment, but Edinburgh can't be far behind. Thank you all and welcome to a celebration of the long life of Patrick Strevens. I shall start with a potted history of Dad's life, which will be followed by a period of contemplation and photographs, but they'll be running all the way through anyway, but don't concentrate on them now because you'll have some time in the middle to look at them in more detail. Then grandson Dan Burrows will give his personal thoughts, and finally Anita and Stephen will focus on his professional life and any messages received recently. If I speak a lot of Dad and Mum rather than just Dad, it's because the two pretty much came as a package and did very little individually, even after 71 years of marriage. Born the child of a music teacher and Trinity House captain, Dad had a fairly peripatetic childhood, born in Swansea and following his parents to Penzance and Holyhead, and eventually attending boarding school in Ackworth, South Yorkshire, for his secondary education. And this was quite a gentle upbringing for him. His beloved brother Peter, who was 6 years older, and adopted sister Sally Mazloumian, who went on to live in Aleppo, Syria. And their religious and social background was fundamentally Quaker socialist, and Dad followed Peter by conscientiously objecting to national service after the war. Outside boarding school, Dad was exposed to wartime poverty, his father having resigned from Trinity House on religious grounds just before the war, and Dad would return to several different temporary homes for school holidays as his parents moved around positions for Friends Relief Service, ending up sheltering with other refugees in the Petersfield workhouse, which was quite appropriate as they were only paid pocket money for their service. As a child, Dad naturally had a maritime immersion, rowing in Holyhead Harbour with his brother Peter, being abandoned for the day on Lundy Island to watch puffins, and passages aboard his father's ship, the Beacon, during school holidays. Post-war, he attended the Royal Academy of Music and then became an orchestral fourth horn player. He met Nancy Sweet at the Welsh Youth Orchestra in 1946-1947 and was won over by being offered half of her banana at lunch one day. Most of you remember that from the last event here. He married Mum in 1950 in Peckham Friends Meeting House, and I suspect that was the last time he visited a meeting house for his own ends. He recently told Anita that he was very proud to still be able to wear his wedding suit, and it appears in several photos through the decades, so we thought it only fitting that he should go out in it today. Joining the LPO in 1948 as fourth horn, he chose not to use the orchestral bus to travel to venues, but joined the orchestral motorcycle gang featured in one of the photos here. Apart from the freedom this gave them, I think there was a small financial benefit too. His chosen bike was a BSA B31, and Mum eventually had an LE Velocette of her own, which was just like the ones local bobbies used to ride around on. Around this time he became a vegetarian in order to try to combat the asthma and eczema he'd suffered from since a child, and discovered the first ever health shop in the UK in Baker Street in London. Hurrah. In addition, he turned to naturopathy and became a lifelong devotee, ignoring conventional medicine. I remember one of the suggestions being a pound of boiled liver per week, which I was very pleased never caught on. When I was shown his medical record by his GP a few years ago, it had one entry concerning laser eye surgery in nearly 50 years with the practice. This regime also seems to have prompted him to amend his religious views into becoming an atheist. In 1952, Dad left the LPO as a result of an internal feud, and he then moved to the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. Their first house was bought around then in Kenton Lane, Harrow, where I was born in 1954 and Anita in 1956, causing our transportation to switch to cars. In 1960, Mum's parents moved to Kent following their retirement. We moved into their lovely Georgian home, which was a hunting lodge near Crystal Palace, and that coincided with Dad's move to the Philharmonia. Shortly after this, he bought our first yacht, an 18-foot-6 Caprice sloop called Shawnee, which was based near Ipswich, leading to many East Coast holidays in the footsteps of Arthur Ransom. These nearly always started with Dad having a major asthma attack and being laid out for a couple of days due to the release of the stress. Following yet another management dispute, in 1964 he left the Philharmonia to become the Kent County Brass Advisor. He admitted to me only last year that following a medical for that job, he'd been told he had a small aortic aneurysm and he should be careful about stress and exercise. In 1965, we moved to Goudhurst into a house which cost £4,850. As part of his new job, he was to procure brass instruments from all over, collecting them at home until he'd got enough, and then would sit in our Heinkel bubble car and have us stuff all the instruments around him so he could distribute them to schools on a day's trip. During this period, he built up brass teaching in the county under the supervision of Bailo de Chileri, whose sons we're very glad to see here today. And he formed the Kent Brass and Wind Quintets. Eventually, Dad became director of West Kent Music School in Tunbridge and finally overall director of Kent Music School in Maidstone. Following the death of Mum's parents in 1975 and 76, Dad had bought a new Hirondelle catamaran which they called Vega, which would now be based on the Medway. They joined the Hirondelle Owners Club and the Cruising Association, taking part in many joint rallies in the UK and Holland, as well as enjoying several solo cruises along Dutch canals. Once, after failing to reduce sail early enough off Clacton, both rudder blades mysteriously broke and floated away after being violently slammed by the rearwards motion of the boat. When Dad tried to use the limited steering provided by the outboard, this too failed, and they had to resort to firing distress flares, which fortunately brought the lifeboat out. This towed them into Brightling Sea Harbour, put them on a mooring, and departed with a flourish, only to go immediately aground on a sandbank with a falling tide. So Mum only made these things worse by rowing out tea and biscuits for the crew. But this led to them buying a radio for the yacht and becoming lifelong supporters of the RNLI. It became a bit of a family joke to guess which colour RNLI sweatshirt Dad would be wearing each time we visited. Their newfound financial freedom allowed them to travel to the Far East and Australia, buying a two-stroke Suzuki 500 twin motorcycle in Perth to discover Western Australia, and which was put on the train to Adelaide to avoid riding across the Nullarbor Desert, being eventually sold in Brisbane after a long grand tour. Campervan fans since the early 60s, they own Bedford, Transit and Toyota vans, and I'm extraordinarily pleased to see the last of them in the car park today. Thank you, Steve. Mum and Dad used to use them mostly for visiting archaeological and naturist sites in France, until they settled on a favourite campsite near Gignac on the Erol River, but despite buying a conventional caravan to be left there permanently, they still travelled to and from in the camper. Additionally, Dad and Mum were both enthusiastic amateur archaeologists, visiting Orkney, Lascaux in France, Malta, and helping to row the replica Bronze Age boat in Dover Harbour. In the village of Goudhurst, having been told when they moved there that it would take 30 years to be thought of as locals, they eventually took part in several aspects of village life. They joined regular walking groups in the local area, and Dad was a member and frequent speaker at the Goudhurst Recorded Music Society, imparting many of his orchestral experiences to the rapt attendees. For several years, he also acted as distributor of the Goudhurst Parish Magazine and was a member of the Goudhurst Historical Society. More locally, Dad used to administer the collective septic tank for Lidwell's Lane and annually hosted massive bonfires for the neighbours in the backfield on fireworks nights. A long-time member of the RSPB, he always enjoyed watching and feeding birds in the garden, going to great lengths to prevent squirrels from taking more than their share. Progressively over the last 7 years, Dad became sole carer for Mum as during her decline into Alzheimer's, and stoically refused more than basic help until just over a year ago, when it became obvious that she had to be admitted into a specialist care home. Only a month later, he had a fall which resulted in a hip replacement operation, putting him in hospital during the period Mum passed away, although he fortunately got to spend a few hours with her shortly before that. Dad made a very determined recovery during last year, casting off the mantle of twice daily care as soon as he could put his own socks on, and eventually walking in the lane most days. To complete his rehabilitation, Dad agreed to Anita and Stephen, certifying him fit to start driving again last August. He also started rehearsing trios with Dan and his wife Ellie in preparation for his 100th birthday party. Despite a lively Christmas during which he got to see all his great-grandchildren, he had a sudden but peaceful passing on the 10th of January. This was a rich and full life, spanning many of the most dramatic events of the last 2 centuries, full of love for his wife and children, but lived in a way which defied perceived convention at the time. In his own quiet way, he was an innovator, a consummate professional and a wonderful example to his students, several of whom we're delighted to see here today. To allow you to concentrate on some images from his years, please listen to the audio portion of Dad's masterful horn solo from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in the Festival Hall, performed under Otto Klemperer in 1961.
Hi everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pat's grandson Dan. I'm here to tell you a little bit about his influence on my generation. That's Becky and Sophie and Jade and John and me. He was always so encouraging to all of us, and we were really lucky to have him as a grandfather. I know that he was also really delighted by his great-grandchildren, Jacob, Louis, Nate and Joshua, all of whom visited him in the last 2 months of his life. Personally, I was very lucky that we grew up in South London, so our grandparents were always very close by, which meant that they were always the on-call childminders. And as my parents are both musicians, they were on call quite a lot. Saturday afternoons for me were particularly good. As all musicians know, Saturday's often the busiest day of the week, so Mum and Dad were invariably off playing somewhere. As a teenager, I spent quite a lot of my Saturday afternoons in Goudhurst, having been collected by Pat from the Music Centre in Maidstone, where both he and Granny had taught. I always remember those drives home being particularly interesting, giving us the chance to talk uninterrupted. Talking to Pat while growing up really taught me to think below the surface layer, try and work out the meaning behind news or politics, for example. While we didn't always agree 100% on the minutiae, on the big concepts, we were always pretty much in agreement. And it's taught me to seek out different viewpoints. During these years, we also had a lot of fun playing duets, as he gave me occasional horn lessons. Since I grew up and entered the music profession as a cellist, I've really enjoyed talking to Pat about what I've been doing. And I think he's enjoyed living vicariously through me. It always seemed like for everything I said, he had an appropriate story from his career. I'm really happy that last summer he was able to watch me playing a televised Beethoven 9 at the Albert Hall, aged 36, particularly because he'd done the exact same thing at the same age in 1964, which was one of his last concerts with the Philharmonia. I'm also delighted by how welcoming Pat was to my wife Ellie. Over the last few years, we've visited most weeks, work permitting, and they developed a really special relationship based on gardening, music, philosophy, birds, and her trombone lessons, which she began both for a little bit of fun and to help inform her work as an ABRSM examiner. She was his last beginning student, and one of the joys of 2022 was once again borrowing one of his horns and playing trios when we visited. And finally, I'm really proud of the video autobiography which I've helped him to make. We've got about 60 videos lasting over 4 hours of Pat telling stories. And I'm now moving on to archiving a lot of his orchestral schedules, letters, newspaper clippings, and so much more. So I'm continuing to learn more about him all the time. I even bought a CD last week of Kusevitsky conducting the LPO, and there on the disc, an interview with Pat. Compete with the tick of the clock in the sitting room. He was a fantastic granddad, and we will all miss him hugely. Thank you.
Having been banned from visiting Mum and Dad during the lockdowns, I'm so glad I spent so much time with Dad in the last year. He was exhausted by looking after Mum, but his determination to look forwards, not backwards, was extraordinary. The day before he died, we spent a couple of hours chatting, and one of the last things he said to me was, "I'm determined to live to 100, you know, just to show off." It was not to be, but perhaps we should have a party on the 8th of June 2028. We're now going to read some of the wonderful messages which we have received from those who have been touched by knowing him, but who couldn't be here today. Firstly, a shortened version of Tony Catterick's obituary written for the British Horn Society. Some of this has crossed over with Neil's, but it's mainly about the music. In 1939, Pat went to Ackworth Boarding School in Yorkshire, where he started to play the horn. Having decided on a playing career, In 1945, he was awarded the Walter Stokes Scholarship to study at the Royal Academy of Music in London. Pat was appointed principal horn in the very first season of the National Youth Orchestra of Wales in 1946. This is where he met Nancy, who was invited to come as a flute player. They were aged 18 and 17 at the time. In 1948, he was appointed fourth horn of the London Philharmonic Orchestra. On moving to the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, his playing was distinguished in his eighth horn bass Wagner tuba playing in many Wagner ring cycles, especially his immaculate playing in the extremely exposed eighth horn, wide-ranging opening E-flat arpeggio of Das Rheingold for many demanding conductors, especially George Solti. After 4 years in the Philharmonia, in 1964, Pat decided to leave the playing profession to spend more time with Nancy and the two children. He joined Kent Music School as the county brass specialist and horn teacher, and played in the Kent Brass Quintet and Wind Quintet alongside Nancy on flute, giving recitals and many schools demonstrations. Pat was a renowned raconteur and had an amazing memory for dates, great horn players from the past he had worked with, and much more. Always keeping his playing to a high standard, from time to time, Pat would come back into the profession and play low Wagner tuba in the last 3 Bruckner symphonies. Tony Catterick was privileged on a number of occasions to play the Wagner tuba sitting alongside Pat for big London concerts. And what a thrill that always was, he said. Small in stature but large in warm friendship to all, with his enthusiasm for the horn and healthy outdoor living, Pat was still reminiscing when Tony last saw him at home in Goudhurst in September 2021, with his razor-sharp memory still on top form.
From Tony Halstead, horn player. It feels like the end of an era. Ellen will always remember Pat's wonderful musical appreciation classes at Kent Junior Music School during the 1970s. For myself, it was always a memorable and enlightening experience to meet up with Pat.
From Paul Pritchard, horn player. He was a wonderful player with a great sound and nerves of steel too.
From Marilyn Bolton, née Whitehead. Pat and Nancy were a huge part of the musical life of Kent, and there was a time when a great many of the orchestras of Britain had one of Pat's students in their ranks. He had a most distinguished career as a professional player. I remember it being said by his peers that he was the best fourth horn in the business. In fact, his influence continues. I have shown the YouTube clip of him playing the fourth horn solo in Beethoven's Ninth to my granddaughter, who is learning the French horn. And whenever she protests about practicing, I remind her that Pat was still playing every day in his 90s. Whenever I think of Pat, I see his lovely smile and twinkling eyes.
From Marjorie Ayling, ex-director of the Blackheath Conservatoire. My relationship with Pat goes back to when I used to play in the Kent Chamber Orchestra with Bela de Cileri, and then to when he tried to teach me to play the horn in the early 70s. He was such a major figure, both as a player and in the whole Kent education scene, bringing such professional distinction, humanity and understanding to all he did.
From Michael Stinton, oboist, youth orchestra conductor and director of music at Abingdon School in Oxfordshire. As a 13-year-old oboist in West Kent Youth Orchestra, Pat gave me all the opportunities that I needed to play the most beautiful orchestral music. I recall discovering Beethoven's First Symphony and the thrill of playing an oboe solo in Schumann's Genoveva Overture. Pat was great at giving confidence and finding opportunities to promote young musicians. That early influence contributed directly to my career as a musician and teacher. I am so grateful to Pat for steering me and countless other young musicians towards a career that has been so incredibly rewarding.
From Helen Crayford, pianist who started life as an amazing trumpet player as well. I was extremely blessed that my path crossed with the unique and charismatic Pat Strevens at 2 key points in my life, at the age of 12 and again in my early 60s. As a young trumpeter in 1965, I was invited to join the adult course at Benenden School. They were playing Mahler's First Symphony, which requires 4 trumpets, so it was an emergency. As I was too young to stay in the adult dormitories, I was taken in by the family of the horn tutor, none other than the Strevenses. The experience was life-changing. They were the first vegetarians I had ever met, and the first family to own a Heinkel bubble car, which had a door where the engine should have been. Moreover, for 2 days I became a partner in crime with Anita, whose room I shared. Fast forward half a century, and I overhear the name Strevens in an orchestral dressing room. After some inquiries, I get back in touch with Anita and am invited to her parents' joint 90th birthday party. What an amazing reunion. In the last couple of years, Pat remained feisty and interested in everything musical. And when I saw him for the last time on the 2nd of January at Stephen and Anita's, he was regaling us all with hilarious anecdotes of his musical life. What a trooper he was.
From Andrew Hay, pianist. What an innings he had. I will always remember him as a kind, gentle-natured pro with an ever-present sense of humour and enjoyment of his life, family and students.
From Christine Hanhart, a Dutch friend. My father Jan, also a horn player, would reminisce with Pat over an aperitif at the campsite in France, meeting there in the summer for many years running. The most beautiful conversations arose about the horn solos that both men still loved so much. Their conversation then moved smoothly from talking about this music to the singing of a horn solo by one, after which the other enthusiastically joined in by singing another horn part. I really enjoyed seeing and feeling the enormous love that Papa and Pat still felt so clearly for their instrument and composers such as Beethoven, Mozart and Britten.
And this is me. I knew Pat for almost as long as I've known Anita, which admittedly is not that long measured against the epochal standards set by Pat and Nancy's marriage. But I knew him long enough to conclude that Anita is a chip off the old block, and that in this case it's not possible to like the chip that much more than the old block. So what to say about the old block? First, as old blocks go, Pat was always struck me as being young. Ridiculously young at heart. I know exactly where Anita got the sparkle in her eye. Secondly, his expertise as a horn player and as a teacher was matched only by the lightness with which he wore it. He is amongst the most accomplished and least self-aggrandising people I've ever met. Thirdly, he was endlessly curious, wide-ranging and wide-eyed in his interests. This is attested by the range of his library and the diversity of his anecdotes about music, of course, but also about the many other facets of his life. Lastly, and perhaps principally, my impression of Pat was of a man who knew how to love, and whose capacity to love was demonstrated through a devotion to Nancy that was at the core of his being. This was an inspiration to lesser mortals, which most of us are. Pat was lovely. It was a privilege to know him, and I shall miss him. But his was a life worthy of celebration, and for that we must be grateful.
The last message is from our dear cousin in California, Mary Momjian. Uncle Pat was like an anchor for me, and the most important link with my mother and the family. He was always sweet, patient and calm, and always there for a chat or to answer questions. Despite the fact that I was not in contact with him that often, talking with him made me feel that all was right with the world again. He was the best kind of uncle to have, and will always be my Uncle Pat. He touched all of our lives in the best way. I'm thinking of you all and sending love, thoughts and prayers. May he rest in peace. We're going to listen to the evening prayer from Engelbert Humperdinck's opera Hansel and Gretel. The two children are lost in the forest, and 14 angels guard them as they sleep. As Pat loved this opera, with wonderful writing for the horns, this seems an appropriate way to say goodbye.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you, that's it. We are now ready to depart and leave it to somebody else. Thank you.
Cheers, mate.